It started with the early research for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Early research said Ryerson was involved in creating schools. When the report came out, it didn't say that because they did more research.
Hello, OneSunnyDay.com podcast. Today, my guest is Ron Stagg, and we're going to talk about Egerton Ryerson and his history. And obviously, we'll get to the end of residential schools near the end. Hello, Ron, and welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on.
I'm glad you could make it, and I'm glad you're here. So we're going to be discussing Ryerson today and his role in history. And what I would like to do is expand up on the history of the time, because some of the attacks on Ryerson don't really need context. It's like a free flowing sort of attack. But some of the other attacks are sort of, a contextualized attack on him that, you can't rate the wisdom or unwisdom of like standardized or organized education without some context of what might be going on at the time, right? And what's going on. Before I get into that, I have a feeling that we might have a lot of students listening, and various people who are obviously very animated and obviously sensitive, as I am, as everybody is, because we're of course on the backside of the discovery of Indigenous children, a revelation of how many were buried, and that obviously creates a lot of I mean, it can't do anything but cause a lot of emotion in people, right, on all sides of this issue. So that's an upsetting story. So on the back of that, I just want to give a bit of a trigger warning. This is a discussion of what happened back in time and the things leading up to it, right? But nothing can erase the tragedy of 6,000 kids dying away from their parents. Nothing will erase that tragedy. And so because of that, this could be an upsetting topic to a lot of people. So I think if you're listening to the rest of this podcast, and I hope you do, I think you should be prepared for a little bit of upset, because it occurs to me, what story are you going to be happy with that's going to make you feel better? That these are great people in history that did their best and failed. That these are evil people, but that will still be upsetting, it seems to me, in all cases. And the second thing I'd like to bring up is that, Ron's been gracious with his time here. I'm asking Ron question. Ron's going to be answering me back in his mind, right? And that is, part of what is the contracted communication. And the contracted communication is, I do the best to ask my questions. Ron does the best to use his vocabulary and his knowledge to answer those questions, right? And we're trying to communicate and get information across. That is diametrically opposed to picking through a conversation, looking for things you don't like and reacting. That's fine. It's a free country, right? But that's not the same as what we're doing. We're just trying to have a conversation, and I'm trying to unearth and get a better understanding of what went on in all contexts. And then we can leave the judging up to individual people, but I don't find there's enough flavor and context in most of these discussions. So my first question to you, Ron, will be, where did when was Ryerson born? What was it like when he was born, right? And what kind of things did he see growing up in terms of education of himself and education of Indigenous parties? What is the world like when Ryerson is born? Is my basic question.
Well, basically, he dates from the beginning of the 19th century. So he was born on a farm, learned farming as a teenager, and then went into the ministry. And he belonged to the Methodist Church, which was the largest denomination in what was then called Upper Canada, now Ontario. It later became part of the United Church. If people have never heard of Methodism. And he spent his early years, he was, I think, 26. He was assigned to the Mississauga Mission, which were the Mississauga people who were, not surprisingly, at the mouth of the Credit River. and he spent uh, a relatively short time there. But while he was there, he um, interacted, I guess you'd say. He farmed with the other people in the community. He learned their language, and he became quite caught up in their culture. Although, as a Euro Canadian, he never fully understood it. Well, you can say so. That's his early years. The population of Upper Canada in 1815, the end of the War of 1812, is about 100,000. So it's a relatively small community. It's not until 1828 that a lot of people start coming. So basically, it's mostly rural. It's mostly farming. And in among people are these reservations or communities for Indigenous people. So that's essentially what it looks like. York, the capital, uh, it's a village. It becomes Toronto, of course. So you're dealing in a very rural, undeveloped area when Ryerson is a young man. By the 1840s, when he gets involved in this issue we're going to talk about, uh, Toronto has been founded 1834. There's a much larger population. There's the beginning of industry, just the beginning, and banking and things like that. So it's a more sophisticated society.
Right. So, but he grows up basically in a. I mean, to just give people context, I think I looked it up. I think like the first train is 1840 or thereabouts. Is that fairly accurate?
50s.
Oh, it's in the 50s. Okay. Took 10 years to get it going. So we're a way away from trains. You know what I mean? It's all people on horseback, right? And you have to. I think it's very important to envision that, because if you don't envision the context of growing up in a society with this amount of wealth generation, with this amount of room to maneuver, right? Like this was one of my questions at this time. I mean, how much room to maneuver do people have growing up? Like when he grows up, are there people still starving to death? Is there a is there does there seem to be enough to go around?
Because so many people are farming, generally they do fine. There are people who arrive with nothing and they have trouble until they get established. But basically, there is food around. There are two, in 1832 and 1834, there are outbreaks of cholera that immigrants bring in, and thousands of people die. You, another aspect, you asked about getting around. Roads are very bad. If you want to go somewhere, it takes you a long time. And if it's spring or fall when the roads are wet, it's even worse. So this is not a movable society, an easily movable society.
Right. So you're most likely to sort of grow up in your sort of little area, bumping into the communities next to you, and that's realistically what you know of the world. You know what I mean, minus books and this kind of thing. So I mean, it is the case that if you're in one of these small communities, there's either a book of algebra, someone to teach you algebra, or there is no algebra. Right? You know what I'm saying? It, it's at a time when if I imagine, when this guy's growing up, if I go there and I'm even trying to teach, I'm saying, hey, I'm going to teach people algebra. A lot of people put up their hands and they go, what good is you know what I mean? What good is that? Kind of thing.
There was no algebra.
Okay, there you go. There was no algebra. Even easier.
You could learn arithmetic. Very few people went beyond public school, and the schools until the 1830s were few and far between. They were usually run by the local community. The teachers were not well qualified. Uh, so getting an education was a hard thing. And most people didn't worry too much if they were going to run the farm. They knew how to add up a few figures, they could keep accounts. That's basically it. So it's a very primitive developing society.
Okay, and then so you mentioned 26. So when he's part of the Methodist Church, he's heavily involved, right? Didn't he have a split with his dad over the Methodist Church? I read a little footnote.
Yes, there were several brothers, and they kept joining different churches. The father was an Anglican, and the fact that Egerton joined the Methodist Church, which actually came out of the United States, was it didn't make him very popular. But say he had other brothers who went into other churches. One who went into a kind of mystic religion, George.
It makes for exciting family dinners, I guess. Um, what's the relative power of the church versus the government at this time? That may seem like a strange question, but
It's actually not. It's a complex question, so I'll try and be as simple as possible. This was a colony. The ultimate power was in the governor, but there were elected people in an assembly and there were appointed people who were in upper house and who were the governor's advisors. And those people were Anglicans, members of the Church of England. And they believed that the best thing for the colony was for it to be Anglican. And they blocked the other churches. There were a number of different um, not factions, different churches. So, in fact, Egerton Ryerson's second job in the 1830s was to fight for religious freedom. This oligarchy that had a lot of power kept trying to block other churches. For instance, you couldn't get married by your own religion or your own minister unless it was Anglican or Roman Catholic or Church of Scotland. So there was a lot of resentment, leading ultimately to a rebellion in 1837.
right. And then so when Ryerson's out there, he's 26. He's now interacting with the Mississauga people. Is he there primarily like in the role of trying to convert to the Methodist Church, or the church just happens to be there? What's his role when he's
Well,
interacting?
obviously, as a uh, minister, his job is to convert. But the point is that a lot of the Mississauga already had converted. In fact, by the 1830s, most of what was called Upper Canada again, uh, had the indigenous population had converted to Christianity. Now, it might be in name only in some cases. For instance, these ministers got quite upset sometimes because the indigenous people, the First Nations, would say, I'm still worshiping my gods, my beliefs. And they'd say, well, that's wrong. You've adopted Christianity now. And the one reply I like was, well, the more gods we have, the better it is. Sorry, his job was to reinforce the Christianity.
That's funny you mentioned that, because I once took I was going through Egypt, right? And then I realized, as you go through Egypt and then you see, the Christian text, they keep sort of going, the one and only true God, the one on go. And I'm like, you can see in this panoply of the birth of these things, you get like what's clearly an Egyptian temple with someone like who just drew a cross at the top. And you can see how they had to be like, we can't just be another, we're trying to explain a different thing. We're just going to go into the pageantry of biblical stories here, and not get that notion across, right?
Yeah, so um, the job of missionaries was to just sort of help reinforce this. But particularly in Ryerson's case, he actually got very much involved in the community. At one point, they sort of adopted him. They gave him the name of a recently deceased chief who was highly respected, a man named Chichok, uh, and they welcomed him into the community. They saw him because he was making these efforts to speak to give sermons in their own language and things like that. They really respected him. No, he actually became lifelong friends with the man who would become chief of the Mississauga, whose name in English is Peter Jones, a very famous man in Ontario history. So they became close friends until Jones died.
Well, this is where This is where you get into elements of history where I mean, if you have a group of indigenous people, at this time that are celebrating him in their midst, I mean, you can't go back 100 years in history, and you sort of have to take their judgment to some level, I would think, and say, at least this time, they considered this guy a positive person, right? You know what I mean? And the other important, I think, historical element is he knows who these people are, right? I mean, that's what you're saying. He's not reading about people in a book that he's never met and have these grand ideas. He's literally out there in the ground farming with them side by side, attempting to speak the indigenous language, right? And is seen as a friend.
Very much so. And when he arrived, he wrote in his diary, I knew nothing about these people. He didn't know their customs, didn't know anything. But he got right in there and became part of it all.
Well, I mean, that's the problem is that's not going to sit well with that's not going to sit with people who are knocking down statues. But we can, you can only take what happened and and present it, and and go from there. So he's and this is going to explain later. Listen, I just assume because of this history and his history and education, later down the pipe, someone's going to put two and two together and say, well, he can come up with these plans and sell them and knows who he's talking about, and for heaven's sake speaks the language. You know what I mean? The language. This is a much easier sell. But at this time, the other thing that's kind of interesting is how much real difference is there in the life of the indigenous people versus the life of the colonialists?
This is at the heart of what we're going to talk about later, residential schools. The First Nations people roamed Upper Canada. They hunted, they fished. It was their traditional life. But because of treaties they had signed, and of course there's talk now about did they really understand, the land basically became the British government's. And the British government was allowing all these settlers to come in, and they were taking away the land that the First Nations used for hunting and fishing and putting them in a very awkward situation.
So the point is, whatever the First Nations people of the time understood about the deal, the British settlers do understand what their interpretation of the deal is, and their interpretation is: once I get this land, this is my land, and if you want to come on it and hunt, the question is: are you paying me? What am I getting out of it? Is that a fair assessment of how they think about it, or?
They, they don't think quite in those terms because First Nations continued for a while to go through. I've read accounts from early settlers, and it's very different from the image you get in the late 19th century. Settlers found Indigenous people interesting, curious. They'd go through the property because you had 200 acres, a little less than 100 hectares, and it was a huge area. It would take you years to clear, so there was still lots of forest, but it was going, and that's the point, that it was going to become more and more difficult for the indigenous people to continue their old way of life.
So are there bands that are going to be more affected by this because just of the area they are, and then other people who are less affected because they're more remote? Is that the?
Yes, and we're going to get into that, I hope. And when we talk about the endorsement of residential schools by a meeting of 30 chiefs who represented the people in South Central Ontario. So, yes, very much so. There's a live and let live at this time that doesn't exist after Confederation. The whole situation changes, partly because of the government action, the residential schools, and partly because the attitude towards Indigenous people changed. As they say, it was kind of live and let live. They had been allies in the American Revolutionary War in the 1770s, in the War of 1812. In the rebellion of 1837, First Nations people came down from townships north or east of Lake Simcoe, came down to help. They saw themselves as allies and friends. So this was all going to change later. But the British government was making plans to take away land from various uh, tribes. They're not really tribes, bands. Um, for instance, they took the Mississauga lands, and this is the 1830s. And Egerton Ryerson, who's over in Britain trying to get support for the Methodist Church, actually tried to use a back way to get to Queen Victoria to try and protect the Mississauga lands. So even though he was now a few years away from his missionary work, he didn't forget people. He actually helped various people advance their careers, various Indigenous people in the 1830s. So he maintained this connection.
Well, secondarily, I mean, just because there's no telephone, right? So the two things that are kind of, I assume, still interesting about this time is there's letters, flying everywhere, and also the letter of introduction. I assume is still a thing. You sort of show up someone's door, and this is my buddy, help him out, and it's like a huge deal that somebody sent this person to you. You know what I mean? And you're like, I'll do what I can because I can't really call on the telephone and see what's going on. So this letter is kind of still a big deal. Okay, so he's 26. He's at the he's a missionary. How long was he a missionary there for?
I forgot exactly, 2 to 3 years.
And then where does he go from there after his missionary work's over?
He becomes the editor of the Methodist newspaper, the Christian Gazette, and he takes on this group known as the Family Compact, the oligarchy who are running things, and he campaigns for religious freedom. And he's instrumental in setting up a post-secondary institution because the only one that exists, at least on paper, is what became U of T, University of Toronto, and it's dominated by an Anglican board. So he sets up Upper Canada Academy, which becomes Victoria College. It's now part of the University of Toronto. So he's campaigning. He becomes famous. He writes all these diatribes against the established authority, and he becomes famous as a campaigner, a reformer.
Because there's kind of like sort of a trick here, right? If whatever church you are, if you're the church and you are the only post-secondary education, right? You're screening. The only people that can get that education are within the church, right?
No, that's the point. Any students could go to this provincially chartered, or it's actually chartered by the British government. They can go to this university, but people resent it because it's the people who are running it are Anglican. It's part of a whole reaction against this idea that I can't belong to my own religion and have the same rights as everybody else. So they overreact, and they don't want nothing to do with this. So this is why other institutions, Regiopolis in Kingston, a Catholic, is said at this time, people see what the authorities, this oligarchy, are doing as being exclusive, as cutting people out, as discriminating against them. So he's on the other side, which is very interesting because in the 1840s, when these issues were all settled, he moves into the middle. And he's kind of a centrist.
Well, I mean, the thing is you got to have this screaming match with your brothers and your dad over like which religion everyone's going to for dinner, right? To sort of, it's not. I think. There, am I right that I'm sure there's like a panoply of people. To a lot of people, the religious element in the church they're going to is really significant. Is that fair? Like it's their community, it's their whole thing.
Yes, and there were very few Anglicans actually. The largest group were the Methodists. So you can understand why they'd be upset about the fact that they couldn't be married by their own minister until the 1830s.
Okay, so for them perspective, this is kind of funny. Well, not it's not funny, but it's interesting. So from their perspective, they're the Methodists. The Anglicans are in charge, right? And they're trying to enforce the Anglican Church from top down, right? And they're sort of like the rebels. You know what I mean? Rebelling against this, but literally, when if you said at this time, the Anglican Church is associated with a bunch of elitists, this would be like literally true. Like no one would debate you on that.
except for the people who were the elitists. They would disagree.
Right. Okay. And then so how long is he working at the paper for, or the
Yeah, he'd be about 38, somewhere around there.
and he's married at this time?
Yes.
The point is he's coming to fame as a champion for education for everyone, not just education for people of the Anglican faith or people that want to go to this Anglican university. Is that fair?
Yes. And of course, in the late 30s, he gets into education. He has another career change. And he goes to Europe and he studies education and he becomes an expert on. He goes to the United States too. He studies all over the place. And so he is seen as the educational expert. And that's why the government appoints him as the head of the, what we would call the Department of Education in the 1840s.
And then so you mentioned there's like the 1840s. So if we had the sea change with respect to the indigenous, we're still on this side of the change with respect to the indigenous people. We're still getting along and living, let living, right?
Still getting along, but it's starting to change. The government is trying to get First Nations to go onto reservations and get out of the way of settlement. And again, this is being driven by the British government because it's still a colony. So they want land for settlement. The indigenous people, the First Nations, are in the way. So it's just beginning to change, but there's still not this attitude that develops in the late 19th century that these people are inferior, they're in the way, we should just kind of push them out and put some um, uh, more advanced people in there, I guess you'd say.
Okay, let's say the people that were the advanced is the thing is advanced, but at least more compliant with this with our structure versus more compliant with some other structure, right? The thing is that that they have a structure of how they think this should work. You know what I mean? And these other people are screwing up this structure by doing what they've done for how you know what I mean traditionally, and that's the point of conflict.
It's really not a point of conflict because the First Nations want to adjust to this. They see it coming. And so it's actually before this whole issue of residential schools come up, the Indigenous people themselves meet with government representatives and say these 30 chiefs who represent all the people or almost all Indigenous people in South Central Ontario, they say this is what we want. We want we want training in agriculture so that we can survive. We can keep our culture. We know that the land is going to disappear. We won't be able to hunt and fish uh, whenever, wherever we want. So they actually ask for this in 1846, the year before Ryerson gets involved in it.
Their fear is I mean, we don't know exactly what everybody's fear is, but the two forks in the river they can see, right, is eventual squeeze out and everybody starves. Or maybe we can develop our own colonies, a little not colonies, but you know what I mean,
Community.
sections of farming with our own culture and our own. Is that because sort of the game is running out? It's like the whole thing just seems to be getting run down by market hunting and this kind of thing, or not?
The game is not running out, but the land is running out. So my understanding of this meeting that was held in 1846, they had a long discussion. I mean, this is a normal thing in Indigenous life. Everybody has to have a say. They have to talk it out. At the end, most of them say yes, but for two reasons. Some of them say we need it. We need to move forward. Others of them say we have to have it or we won't survive. So it's kind of a combination.
Did they see, like, is there like a stark sort of productivity difference between like what the farms are doing that are like the colonist farms with this training? I don't know nothing about farming, so I'm not, you know what I mean, and what they can produce at farming.
They have a different type of farming. They basically um, go into an area. They, I guess, plant things like corn and so on. The women look after that while the men hunt and fish. So it's farming, but on a very simple scale. They don't know about the use of manure. They don't know about crop rotation. When the land is exhausted, they simply move the community somewhere else. And again, that's going to become more and more difficult.
Oh, just as time goes by, it's going to be more and more difficult to.
Relocate, yeah.
So they come for this meeting and they say we need to basically get into the sphere of farming. We want to get into that sphere and we want to learn how to farm. I guess I don't want to use some triggering language, but I guess your way would be the more mechanized way that you're farming is what we want to learn, right? And they have a meeting. There's a big talk about it, and they approach the government and they say,
The government actually approaches them. The meeting in Aurelia, where all these people were, the government came to them to discuss this idea of agricultural schools. So the impetus came from the government, but the reaction came from the indigenous people.
because they're like, okay, this is basically the path forward, right? We'll become sort of a farming, localized farming community. We have lands set aside to us that are at this point, at least the borders are holding, I guess.
The governments, again, the British government's already started to take land away. When these treaties were negotiated, indigenous people tended to think, okay, we've made this agreement so we can share the land. And of course, Europeans said, well, we've had a treaty, we've effectively bought the land. So they were actually moving people off land that was partially developed. So the Mississauga lost their land. As I said, Egerton Ryerson tried to stop it, but the Mississauga lost their land. They, they moved in with the community at Grand River. They were welcomed by the community there to join them. So they're now known as the Mississauga of the New Credit.
Is this just like a moment, or is this over time? Like, are people just rolling up and saying we're clearing out, or is it just like a slow?
It begins in the mid to late 1830s. There is such a protest against this that the government abandons it and looks for another way. And this man, Peter Jones, who becomes a Methodist minister, he and another prominent Methodist, he's very prominent, say to the government, there are these things called residential schools in the United States. They teach you how to farm. They work well. You should do it. The government says, eh. But when this whole scheme to seize the land meets opposition, the government thinks, particularly the British Indian Department, okay, we can put these people onto farms, and then all this money we have to pay in treaty obligations, we don't have to pay it anymore. So this is what drives the government, a chance to put these people in settled communities.
And this is the first. This is the sort of assimilation complaint, right? They toggle between two ideas. The one idea is kind of everyone is eventually merged into one. You know what I mean? Untangleable soup of humans, right? The you can't really see anymore the indigenous people as a distinct group. They're all just sprinkled through, intermarried, 100, 200 years later. You know what I mean? It just like sort of dissolved and absorbed into the structure versus always broken out on their own separate place doing their separate thing. And my understanding is, like, as history goes on, people get either idea. It's sort of toggles. You know what I mean? The conflict will be resolved by all being one undefined mass. Then the conflict will be resolved by being two separate people on their own area, right? And they sort of toggle back and forth. Is that accurate, or some people think X, some people think Y, or not so much?
You could say, in the very broadest sense, yes. the point is, in this period, there's no idea we're going to make these people Europeans. They're welcome to keep their traditions, their way of doing things, their dress, all of these things. But there is this desire to put them on farms, which First Nations say, yeah, this is the way of the future. So they don't want to change their customs and so on. They want to be able to preserve them, but the way to do that is to adopt a sedentary lifestyle.
Right.
Now, I was going to say, now the churches, the Methodists particularly, because the Methodists control most of the education, the schools that are on in the communities. There are schools in almost all of the indigenous communities. The Methodists control them. They're Europeans. They would like nothing better than to see these people adopt European customs. But the key thing here is they're not going to uh, pressure these people to change, unlike what happens after Confederation. They're simply going to educate them, and they say, "Gosh, we certainly hope that these people will adopt the European way of doing things." But they don't. They don't try, and that's one of the things that's very important to understand. What happens in the later residential schools after Confederation? That is brutal attempt to assimilate, basically, to terminate all traces of Indigenous culture.
Okay, so then this conversation comes up, and then somebody at this point thinks to myself, okay, well, if we're going to these residential schools, and if the First Nations are on board, there has to be some kind of curriculum, right? Who are we going to talk to about the curriculum? Is that where Ryerson gets involved?
Yeah, because he's considered the educational expert. He's already 3 years earlier set up, beginning the setup of the Ontario educational system, and he works fanatically at this for most of the rest of his life. So this is an aside. He's approached and say, we need a curriculum for agricultural schools to train these people so they can work on farms. And Ryerson, because of his experience, says, yes, we can help these people. He's coming from a farming background. He's worked with the Mississauga, and he believes that if they are trained in agriculture, they will be able to keep their culture. But the key thing here, this is something that the critics use. They're going to set up these separate schools. They're going to separate the people. Most Indigenous children, First Nations children, go to schools in their community. The residential schools that are set up are in addition to that. So there are only ever two schools, and that's one of the problems. The government said they'd fund 3 schools, they didn't. So some people would have to go so far, the children have to go so far, that it just wasn't workable. That's one of the problems with this.
So at this time, just as a question, because it's one of the things. So is in the Indigenous community, like, how many people would speak English?
That's very hard to say. Um, I would think that people who interacted uh, in any level with white people would know some English. Education was in English. So the schools in the communities run by the Methodists. One exception, of course, is in Brantford, where the Church of England runs the school. But you're taught English, but how well you learn it, I can't say. So theoretically, the majority of Indigenous people would speak English,
Or have a little at school from their sort of localized schools. Okay, so meanwhile, you get this flyer. So what does it mean when he's setting up the Ontario education system? Like, what does that mean to you on the ground when this comes in? How is it different after it's been set up versus before?
the education system as a whole.
Yeah, well, just the part for the, I want to say colonialists. You know what I mean? Just the part for the regular people.
The term these days is settler.
Right, settler. Okay.
Yeah, that's what people use. It's a term with connotations.
So my question is, if you're a settler, because this is the part that Ryerson is sort of famous, like is celebrated for, right? Is that he's the champion of bringing this in. So that's why we got statues, is because he's obviously noted for bringing in this education system. So my question is, how does that change day to day? Why are you so excited about that if you're just an average person going about your business?
So if you are an average person in Upper Canada, 1841, it became Canada West. But if you're an average person, your chances of going to school early on are very limited. The education will be not very good. You'll be out for large parts of the school year helping on the farm, uh, and you won't go beyond primary school. You probably won't have that many books. You'll have to share books around. They could be American books. People are learning American things rather than Canadian. Uh, and people drop out of schools. They say they don't need it. What am I going to use a secondary, high school education for on the farm? So what he does is to bring in standardization, bring in teacher training, so there are good teachers available. He tries to improve the quality. He gets textbooks, which are Canadian textbooks. And ultimately, he campaigns for required education. That is, you can't leave until you finish your primary school. So there are lots of people around Upper Canada, Canada West, who are semi-literate. They haven't gone to school enough to really learn that much. Why do I need it? I just have to run my farm. So what he does is to bring in standards, to bring in proper teaching, to bring in proper textbooks, and he insists that everybody should have an equal education. So Catholics are a minority. They are discriminated against. French who move into Ontario are discriminated against. And he says, no, everybody's going to get the same education. So that's why he was revered until this whole issue of residential schools came up.
Okay, so the one element there that I pick out as interesting is also this guy's been to Britain. He's traveled around at this point, right?
Well, he's gone through Europe.
Yeah, but the element there is you can see the future that's a coming, right? Like you can see what this whole cosmopolitan, there's like, you know what I mean? You can see you can start seeing these things, and you could sort of go, okay, well, you could almost, is it fair to say that you can start seeing, you know, what mechanization is going to start doing? Is that fair? Or you can see you can see what learning is going to bring people.
Yes. And one of the things that you have to remember about people like Egerton Ryerson, he's a mid 19th century small L liberal. He believes in progress. And he believes, of course, that Europeans are at the top. They're the most progressive. So when he makes recommendations for these agricultural schools, he's being patronizing. He wants to have these people. But this is the one thing you can say against him. He's a man of his time. So he's saying the best way for you to develop is to adopt agriculture, which is the European way. So he sees everybody moving forward. He wants Indigenous people to move forward with Euro Canadians.
Because I did note there's one attack that goes, well, sort of goes, well, the settlers, which is the term you say, is going to these sets of schools, but there's this sort of lesser Indigenous agriculture school, and now he's like his recommendation is bifurcation of the population.
And this, of course, is wrong. As they say, most children, First Nations children, go to a school in their community. It's run by, in most cases, the Methodist Church, but they are taught there. So when these residential schools are set up, they're in addition. So there are only a few dozen students in the two schools at any time. And it's supposed to be designed for older students who already have some basic um, education in their local school, and they can go to these residential schools voluntarily, and they can learn about agriculture. So this is the dream of the future. This is the dream for Indigenous people. This is the dream for Egerton Ryerson.
And so, what age would you about go to the residential school? I know it's all over the place, but
It is all over the place. For one thing, Egerton Ryerson said, older boys should go. Why would girls go? They're not going to run the farm. Well, girls did go. They were a minority, but they went to these schools too. So it wasn't necessary all older children. That was the majority. But so the ages were all over the place.
so the idea was you go to school in your local community. That's sort of the basics. If you want this extra school with an agriculture focus,
Yeah.
you go to these residential schools for some amount of time and you come back. About how long were you schedule? Like how long was the program there?
It wasn't a set time. Even the schools that Ryerson set up, people still would go out at harvest time to help in the farm. So you could be in school longer than the set number of years. But the anticipation would be 4 or 5 years, something like that.
So the differentiation between the normal school and the residential school is the residence is like a boarding school, kind of in the dream European model where the kids can stay there as opposed to shuttling back and forth.
In fact, Ryerson patterned these after a school for the poor in Switzerland that he had seen. So when he came up with this curriculum, it was based on this model. Uh, so it wasn't, particularly original.
So just one question here: why are the churches still running all these things? Is it tradition, or is it because they have the money, or why is it?
Oh, it's tradition. And in fact, that becomes one of the issues after Confederation. The churches don't have the money and the government doesn't give it to them. And that's why you have the horrible nutrition, disease, and so on in the later residential schools, which doesn't exist in these, but they only last a short time. These schools have failed by Confederation.
Right, because no one goes to them is basically the problem, or
it's a combination. One of them is everybody will react and say, oh, yeah, the government's cheap. They're supposed to set up 3 schools. They set up only 2. So some people won't go because it's just too far. In the program, you're supposed to get land, right? So you can farm. The government's going to give you that. They never do. So they starve it. They starve these schools. And then the students find the curriculum grueling. You get up early in the morning. You have your prayers and so on. You go to school, and then you go out and work about 8 hours in the fields, and then you come back, and you have more religious studies. You have more education. So it's a grueling schedule. A lot of them just say, "Forget it. I'm leaving," and they just leave. Or in some cases, their parents come and get them, and the parents find out their children have learned how to farm. There are no farms, and they've lost those years of learning the traditional ways. So they're kind of useless. So, often the parents say, "Forget it. We're just taking them out."
right? And this is still like this is the 1840s when it's still sort of phase one. Residential school you can go to or not go to. The parents can come get you. This is just an option that you can take or not take.
These schools, and this is where the people who make this connection with Ryerson, these schools are totally different. It's voluntary. The government runs the school, the church supervises it, but the teaching is done by regular teachers from the regular system. In the later schools, all the teaching is done by the clergy. When you're there, once you're not in class, you can talk to people in your own language. Not in the later schools; they're going to get rid of any trace of Indian in the children. So it's completely different. And the later schools don't use this curriculum. So there's nothing from these schools that transfers to the later schools except for the name.
So but these ones are running parallel with Ryerson's life, right? He's still alive while this is
The residential schools we know of were set up 3 years after he died.
So he sees these phase out. He sees these fade out in his lifetime, right? But he's more. The thing is, his life's work, so to speak, is making sure that every Canadian kid, sort of regardless of what the parents think, go to school and pump as much education into these kids as we possibly can,
That's right.
and put in the element that your parents can't say no. Like you'll kind of override them and say no, your kid has to go to school, which still exists to this day, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so that's why he's trumpeted as this in the time, or as this like crusader for education in a time when you could find people that were going, why should we do that? That costs a lot of money.
Yep,
These kids, and they're talking about settler kids. They're talking about their own kids. They're like, these kids don't need to know this stuff. They're going to
exactly.
be, on the farm. And he's like, one element of I can see the future because I've been to Europe, right? So I can see how these educational skills are going to, you know what I mean, are going to play a role in the future.
Yeah,
Like being able to read is becoming more and more a thing. Like there's a newspaper, right? Like if you can't read the paper, if you don't know what's going on. Um, and then I did read one quote of his idea of how this has to factor into sort of the democracy, right?
going back to this oligarchy in the 1820s and 1830s, they don't want uneducated people to have any power. And what Ryerson is saying is education is power. We have to educate people so everybody can take part in uh, the society.
That's the upside, is that he's the crusader for the relatively universal education.
Now, I was going to say one thing I should point out at this point, because he is so wrapped up in this whole thing with these residential schools, it's a one-off. The Indian department says to him, "Can you give us a curriculum?" And he takes a while because he's so busy, and then he sends it to him. And that's the last thing he has to do with it. He's not involved with this. He's involved with the overall education.
But he's dead by the time they polish off some curriculum and start these new, more pernicious residential schools.
It's 3 years after he's dead.
Right. And your point is the second version of the residential schools, right, are just about wipeout.
Yes, absolutely, totally. They are cruel. They're inhumane. And it's this idea that we've got to make these people white so we can get them out of the way of all these progressive people. That is an idea that pervades, particularly in the 1890s, when the British Empire is the strongest empire in the world. And Canadians, a lot of Canadians identify with that. And they tend to look down on everybody else: Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans, Irish Catholics, French, Indigenous. So it becomes a quite intolerant, which it isn't uh, back in the 1830s and 40s.
So it's kind of you kind of have an interesting duality here. Anybody who's listened to this deep of the podcast is going to get a surprise, right? Because your basic instruction is these residential schools were pernicious. You know what I mean? Were set up with the idea of culturally eradicating the culture of these people. The one tidbit is that Ryerson didn't really have anything to do with it, and that's a big tidbit of historical accuracy.
The people who want to blame him make a direct connection between the schools for which he only does this one thing, the curriculum, and the later schools. But there isn't any connection. It's a totally different concept. And it's a very small part of the educational network for First Nation people, right? Most of them will just go to the local school in their community.
Who's running that local school? Like, is it still the churches and the local community?
Churches, and most of them Methodists.
And so, why do some communities not have these schools and are reliant on the residential school?
It's an addition, right? Morrison says we don't have the resources to put uh, a teacher for agriculture in every community. It's much better to centralize it and create a few schools where the children who want to can go.
But and then its later, more pernicious version all of a sudden becomes mandatory. We're past the Ryerson.
Not immediately.
Right.
It's voluntary, and then the government starts putting pressure on um, the communities to send their children. And then just after the First World War, it becomes mandatory. And that's when you really see the horrors of the residential school system, when people are forced to go. They already exist, but it gets much worse. So you have, if you know it's bad, you've been there, you know it's bad, you have no choice. You have to send their children. Now, some still manage to escape, but basically, it is a requirement.
And that, but this is after World War One, right?
Yes.
So is that just a general toughening? Is it like getting tough all over? It's getting mechanized all over, or is it?
Now, what happens is the government, and a lot of this is done by civil servants. Now, I suspect a lot of members of parliament never knew about this. They didn't know what was going on. But anyway, the people who were running it discovered that a lot of people didn't want to go, right? And how are you going to force these people to become white if they won't go to a school that makes them? So that's why they make it mandatory.
So the first version in the community didn't have that same feel to it, right? You went and did your class in English, and then whatever kids are doing at recess, no one cares.
Exactly.
And then we've set up real this real construction that these people are going to come in, and then they're going to that we're going to blow away any element, that doesn't seem to sort of be this productive citizen that we're imagining, fill them full of farming knowledge, and then send it back to a place where they cannot farm in the method that we've just taught them.
The curriculum also has the regular, reading, writing, arithmetic.
Yeah.
They learn some geography and things like that. So they're trying to continue what they'd get in their local school, but add in this other element. And it's just, there's too much. The children can't handle it.
Yeah. So I did read a synopsis. Well, I read one article in which the person was sort of made the summary error that conflated the two things. Like, he could tell they weren't set up until Ryerson died. You know what I mean? But then had the idea in it that he architected this thing. He architected this madness, and then it died. And then somebody took evil Plan A off the shelf, architected by him, and sort of put it into proposition. And then that quote, it details what the kids are learning, and it's like geometry. It's all the usual suspects. Like, you'd think this is somebody trying to produce a well-rounded education, right? And so you've elucidated the major point. The reason why that doesn't seem compatible with these nightmare scenarios of someone trying to, like, why would you spend the time, energy of educating people in like geography, literature, what I mean? If you simultaneously sort of brutalizing them, it doesn't quite make exact sense. But your point is it makes more sense because they're two separate different things run by different people in a different time.
Yes, but the later school does give you reading, writing, arithmetic. But one, you cannot, even when you're not in class, you cannot speak your own language. And two, you are taught that this is the way. And you're taught that all of your um, cultural traditions are wrong. That's not what happens in the order system. That's the point.
Right. Yeah. It's real indoctrination is your point.
No, absolutely. And even more than indoctrination in some ways, because it's so cruel.
Because you've then returned these kids out onto these reservations where it's, I assume, very hard to make use of most of the skills that you've just spent, like, what if you go back to a place where there's very few English books, for example, what is it? You know what I mean? What does it matter if you're, you know what I mean? It's that you're stamping the people out into a mold, but they're not really able to live in that molded condition, even if it would work. Does that make sense?
I think what it does to people's minds. You go back to the reservation. You're a new person, right? You've been pushed into this mold, and the lifestyle in the community is very different.
Right.
One of the big things is because you've been away, because you have been indoctrinated, you want to call it, you have no emotions. You not learn. You haven't learned to hug people, to love people. And that's the huge damage that these later schools do. They destroy families. You just don't belong. You don't fit in.
That I think is a major point. And then I took a rough. Is there anything else that you think's germane to the whole?
Uh, excuse me. There was one residential school in existence before this government scheme in the 1840s. This was the Mohawk Institute in Brantford. This was unusual. It was the Church of England running the school. They were running it in the 1820s. In 1831, they decided to open a residential school. Most of the people from the community there continued to go to the regular school. People were actually applying, and you had to apply from other communities to come and learn at this residential school. It had a very good reputation. After Confederation, everything fell apart. And this became one of the institutions known for mistreating Indigenous people. So here you go from something that was highly respected and wanted to an institution that's just like all these other residential schools. And that really shows you the transition that takes place.
Well, you also got to be careful here, because also what it shows you is there's no arrow of history, right? People love this history's an arrow; it's always somehow going one magical way, and racism goes away and can never come back. You know what I mean? But your point is, oh no, it's very easy to synthesize, not very easy, but it's possible to synthesize a community that before didn't have these ideas, and then because of a lot of reasons they just come marching back in, and the second that other group is marginalized and nobody really cares about them.
Think of this. Here you have a group of clergy in the 1830s teaching in a school. They get a lot of respect. You have a group of clergy from the same church in the 1890s who are going along with the government plan. They are mistreating the First Nations children. Same church, same school, but a totally different approach to things. You have an early approach where we're still relatively getting along with Indigenous people, the exception being the British authorities. Uh, and then this later period where we're trying to obliterate them.
So one of the things that blows up is something that people is sort of one of the common new accusations is this kind of like institutional through line, right? It's like they sort of say, well, the colonialist project or the colonialist has this like through line of evil from A to B, right? And your point is there's dips and ups and downs. It's not like that. It's not like uh, a a a completely combative situation until someone in Britain sort of orders it to be a combative situation, and then that's the sort of spark of.
But of course, the worst is not the British government, which uh, gives up control before Confederation. It's the Canadian government.
Right.
Now, when they all that fuss about Johnny MacDonald and some of the other people in his cabinet came up, yes, they are responsible.
Right.
But the people earlier on are not. They're running a different system. It's not compulsory. It's not designed to assimilate. It's designed to help them adjust. It's different. And even beyond that, Egerton Ryerson, all he does is send us a little note saying, here's the kind of curriculum. He doesn't run the schools. He doesn't administer schools. He has nothing to do with it.
Well, and
But
the other point is the other like element is that he's asked to design a curriculum for an agricultural school, right? I think that's the original request, because
yeah,
one of the attacks is he's kind of attempted to develop this belittling uh, uh, different education system. You know what I mean? He's got the bifurcation argument. That's the subtle racism, the systemic racism. He wills this bifurcation into two schools. But your point is, it's an optional thing you can do or do not.
and there's already another school system. Yeah, big one.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that see that the thing is that blows that blows the through line argument, right? Because the attack through line argument is kind of like it's like it's the line of the same people with the same attitudes, or they're just like it's like if you sit there and you say, well, a clergy from, you know 1830 is different from a clergy at 1890, like their respect, what's going on, all these people are jockeying for position, right? Well, unfortunately, that blows your narrative. Now you're going to have to read a book. Well, you are, if you know what I mean. You either dismiss it and say, well, the church is the church through all ages, right? Or you're like, oh well, this is more difficult than I could think. So that's the I mean, I think one of the must be the frustrating element for you is that you constantly, for example, I've read thing after thing after thing, and somebody will write like, well, I didn't know much about Ryerson until I became aware last week of his implication in this thing. But you never get in that article, what is your smoking, like what is the element that you're upset about, right? You don't really get it in that article. I've looked through a lot of articles to try and figure out, you know what I mean, what the other perspective is, but you don't know what that person really, they never detail what exactly they're upset about.
You've got a couple of things at work here. People are very upset. We talked a little bit about it before we started on this. People are very upset. Indigenous people and so-called woke people. They're usually young people. They've looked at the world, you know, sexual predators, um, black people being mistreated by police, all sorts of things going on. And often young people say, this is the environment. I want to change this. So that's one of the things. And then there are the other people who feel, particularly people who are indigenous or in some cases black, who feel this oppression. They feel it in their bones and they want to get even. They want to punish. And here you have Egerton Ryerson, very handy. You got a statue, it's right downtown Toronto. So it's a good place to focus all your anger. And so you don't need to know details. And when you do hear details, often it's these distortions that people put out. There are people who have distorted the whole narrative, again, because of their feelings. They've distorted the narrative because they want to get Egerton.
I think that some of the people, especially in the press, distort the narrative because they kind of know the narrative that can get published. You know what I mean? Like if you're writing for certain publications and certain things, you know that nobody wants to hear this. You know what I mean? Hear this. They don't want to hear this other narrative because the problem is this narrative, right, puts you in a world of trouble on multiple axes, right? Because
Complicated world, yeah.
it's a complicated world because you're now bifurcating Ryerson as a person who took the time to at least figure out who indigenous people were and learn to say a couple words to them at least and was revered as such, right? Okay, so now you have a statue of this person who you're celebrating what this guy did, right? And you imagine that if you took a person from that person who made him a member of the tribe and took him 100 years in the future and said, here's a statue of this great person, that person would go, well, that's great. I'm happy to see this statue and happy to see this person's revered and happy to see all these kids learning about someone who reached out to the indigenous community and at least took 10 minutes to figure out how to talk to us in our native language, right? Now it's way worse. It's way worse because you don't even know what you've done. You've targeted the wrong character, right? Through history. And I took a couple quotes out of read through sort of things that some of the Ryerson people were saying, and they'll say something like, this wasn't a crime. This was a sort of a blow to draw attention to this issue. And I'm like, okay, so first of all, we had attention on this issue. We had smart scholarly people, and you know what I mean, some kind of process ongoing, right? Two, it is a crime, first of all, because that's not the way how we decide things in any communication, any society, anywhere, right? Is you don't want a society where random people just decide upon themselves they're smarter than everybody else, and they know what to do, right? And they just go do it. And third, you've sort of done, you sort of, why do we have these big processes? Why do we have learned things? Why do we have universities produce reports? To avoid embarrassments like this.
Yes, and the point of this whole thing is there's no pamphlet you can get that gives you all this information. People have to go and look, and a lot of them don't want to bother. They know. Uh, it really comes out. It started with the early research for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Early research said Ryerson was involved in creating schools. When the report came out, it didn't say that because they did more research.
Yeah, I mean,
But
I have it. It's I looked it up because I don't like, you know what I mean, talking. And what it says is, I'll just do it. It says in 1947, Egerton Ryerson, the superintendent of schools for Upper Canada, recommended the establishment of residential schools in which Aboriginal students would be given instruction in English language, arithmetic, elementary geometry, or knowledge forms, geography, and elements of general history, natural history, agricultural chemistry, writing, drawing, vocal music, bookkeeping, especially in reduced to farmers' accounts, religions, and morals. As the he thought as though plain English education adapted to the working farmer and mechanic. The object is identical with that of every good common school. That's supposed to be a quote from him. And then pupils should be, we're back in quote, taught agriculture, kitchen gardening, mechanics, so far as mechanics is connected with making and repairing most useful agriculture implements. And then it says, after the release of the report, the Methodist missionaries operated a number of school boards in southern Ontario in 1850. One of the Mount Elgin School at Mercytown, later Moonsea, I don't know how to say that, did not close until 1946. The first of what would be a string of Roman Catholic residential schools in what is now British Columbia opened in the early 1860s. A school in Fort Providence in the Northwest Territory began taking students in 1867. That's what I read.
yeah, there's nothing there about what Ryerson did because he didn't do it.
See how this is converted. So that's from the Truth and Reconciliation Report, which you would think would have to be, if anything, a more damning account of colonialist actions in Canada than any possible document you'd think. Nobody's, you know what I mean? You would think that that would be the most damning account. But then I wrote this David Nicky June 13 piece. I'm just going to do this for contrast for people listening. And he wrote, Ryerson was dead for 16 years by the time the federal government implemented the plan he recommended in 1847. Well, that's a long time. You got to go 16 years later. You got to go back to someone and say, "Did you like your plan of 16 years ago?" But anyway, okay, I can't interrupt this text because that's not quite fair. But the Canadian residential school system was his brainchild. That year, a dozen years before slavery was abolished in the US, Ryerson devised a system that took Indigenous children from their families with the express plan to educate them as agricultural laborers and to erase any cultural, linguistic, and familiar relationships that they might have had to their own cultures. The result of this would be a class of laborers doing the work in Canada that was left to slaves in the southern US. Then he wrote, this is not explicit, and likewise, Ryerson did not explicitly recommend that those children be physically, psychologically, and sexually abused, malnourished, and in many cases left to die. But the Christian organizations he recommended to take charge of the schools facilitated thus that. That to me is attempting to make a bunch of linkages, like somehow he was trying to produce a slave.
They don't exist. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes he's trying to produce a slave class. The idea that they're educated as agricultural laborers is removing the music, the general education elements. It's making it seem like they're trying to set up some sort of, the point is, and I'm not attacking, him specifically, but
I will.
okay, fair enough. There's lots of articles of the same class.
Yes, there are.
And my point is, that is just not echoed by the Truth and Reconciliation. It's just not in there. It's not what it says. It's not the impression it gives you from reading it. It's got plenty of bad things to say about people operating in Canada. You know what I mean? But that's not one of them. And this is the other interesting element. We'll just tap your brain these last final points and wrap up. So there's one quote I got, you get from lots of parents, because they say, oh, we're going to change the name of the school. And the person says, good, it'll produce an opportunity to have some sort of educational moment in the minds of the children. And I always think, I don't know what to make of all this whole thing. What are you going to tell someone in grade 1?
Well, It's a lot easier with people who have been exposed to some things. Most students don't know a lot about residential schools, so at least they have some idea they existed. So that's much easier. But you're right. Somebody in grade one who says, why did they pull that statue down? Trying to explain a complex thing like that. And what can you say? Well, some people thought he was a bad man. It's very, very difficult to do. What we've been talking about is this is a very complex issue. The people who've been pushing for the statue to come down, the university to change its name, simplified. How I see this whole thing is like the snowball at the top of the mountain. You drop the snowball, it rolls down, it picks up snow as it goes, it becomes a great big ball, and it smashes everything at the bottom. That's what happened here. So this initial suggestion by early research for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, people caught on to that. They didn't listen to the actual report, and they blew it up. So this Aboriginal Educational Council came out with this little paper saying Ryerson's responsible. And everybody picked up on that. As I said, the Wikipedia article uses that as its source for Egerton Ryerson being being responsible for residential schools. So it's gotten out of control. And some people say, "Oh yes, he's responsible." Know nothing about it. They've just been told. So it's blown way out of proportion. And people don't go back and look at the actual records. They're there. This isn't something we make up, and I'm not the only one who feels this. Only a historian. We don't make it up. The documents are actually there.
Well, that's the great thing, because I know no history whatsoever. I'm totally ignorant of history, but I did read a couple books on the Civil War. The one by Shelby Foote I really like, and in there you're like, this is like a dream. These people write letters. They just keep puking out to their wife what they think and feel in these huge long letters. That then you can read, and you'd think, well, he wouldn't. It seems a bit odd that he would, sort of write this letter to his wife full of, he doesn't think it's going to be some historical document. He's just writing a letter to his wife about what's going on. And then it's a great treasure trove of what these people are thinking that you probably won't even have today.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Finding this material while we were researching this, um, we came across a letter from. He was the civil secretary to the British governor. He was involved with the um, India Department, and he's the one who contacted Egerton Ryerson and said, "Will you do this thing for me or for us?" And he wrote a letter, which we found, and this is what you're talking about, which said, "I hope you'll hurry up with this. There are people of different stripes who would do everything they can to prevent a policy which will bring our Indian brethren to an equal level with Europeans." So here's somebody high up in the government. He's a civil servant. He's high up saying, "We're trying to use this system that Ryerson's going to be a part of. We're going to use this system to try and help these people." So that's exactly what you're talking about with the letters about the Civil War.
Well, and the second complexity of the whole thing is the room to maneuver these people have in the political context in which they live, right? So they're all making public statements, you know what I mean? And trying to get a mass of people to come along with them. Lincoln's kind of a good example of this. He's trying to get everybody to come along with him, right?
Yeah.
But even if you have a radical position, if you're a politician, you're insane to just spill out the complete total radical position, historically day one. You're kind of like you got the Titanic, you're trying to nudge this thing, in the direction you want to go, right? So that's the other. I think that's the other a problem of taking just sort of a loose comment here and a loose comment here and trying to amplify it is if you don't have the context of where, you know what I mean, of what's going on. I'm sure you can get these people to have them say all sorts of terrible things about all the churches they don't like. You know what I mean? And pull this comment out and say, well, this is what this person thinks of the Catholic Church. Meanwhile, they're a devoted Methodist. They just don't like, you know what I mean? This, that, or the other thing. So I think So I think what's interesting, I think you've gone over the direct sort of causal, the direct sort of causal cases. So the arguments that I pick up, here's the arguments that I picked up against this thing. The first one is the association argument. Ryerson has been associated with this thing now, and this thing makes me feel bad. I don't want to see this thing that makes me feel bad.
Or even makes me so angry.
Yes. Uh, so I'll throw that one in for you, because the problem with that is, uh, no one allows you not, to not hire Germans because of, an association with the Second World War, right? You're not allowed to make this association say, well, this thing makes me feel bad. The rational party is still able to put their hand up and say, well, hold on, you need some sort of causal rational link to get us to come along with you. Otherwise, just a group of people professing feelings, good, bad, anger, you know what I mean, at different things. Everyone who doesn't get a job feels very angry at that moment, you know what I mean, and upset at that moment, and to that moment. So I'll throw that argument out, because I think that argument that you feel bad in and of itself is trumped, has to be trumped by the fact that you feel bad about something. Unfortunately, you're wrong. You're going to feel even worse once we straighten you out. You're going to want to go back to the previous state, right? When you were just angry, because now you're angry, and just took the head off a statue of a person who was promoting equalized and fair education laws Canada, instead of keeping education expensive and, to a relative elite class. So the second argument is the kind of what I think we've covered admirably here, which is the causal thing. Did he plan this up as a master plan? It just sat on the shelf until he died, and then someone went, evil plan B, let's roll it. And your point is, there was an initial good attempt by people in the government to make the residential schools a positive thing. Those actually failed. Then second, they revisited the residential school in progressively evil forms as the situation deteriorates. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, they only used the name and they made it something totally different. A couple of things we should say about this. Number one is there are people who are publishing or saying to the news media things that are wrong. They're misinformation. Whether they're doing it intentionally or unintentionally, they are stirring people up. The second thing is there are two things about history. One is the historical record, and the second is historical memory. Historical memory is how we remember history, and that's not necessarily what actually happened. And there are people, and this is what you're saying, there are people who want to believe that is what happened. So they're creating their own past.
Well,
Their
there's
own
two other,
past.
I think there's subtly two other classes of people. So there's one class of people I'll, who basically are like, well, the whole contraption is evil, of going to another place and scraping the people, who live there into ever smaller reservations, right? The problem is, no one is putting their hand up and going, no, I defend. You know what I mean? You're not defending the actions of the later governments. You're condemning the actions of those people in
Yeah.
governments. So they've sort of missed an ally in a way. You know what I mean? Because it's much more powerful to say, well, hold on, this guy is not responsible for that. We can give him a pass in statues. However, these people really are responsible, right? That's a really powerful ally, because you're actually sorting these characters out, you know what I mean, and sorting these actions out and providing a context of how you might think about them, right?
Yes, but some people don't want that. They, Ryerson has become the symbol, the thing. If we get that, that will help us heal.
I don't listen, there's another sort of weird, I don't want to say weird, that's not fair, aspect I picked up. And there is a contingent out there, and they're sort of just anti-Western government in general, right? They're anti enlightenment, liberality, like all these sort of free speech. They're this bucket of things they think has created this offensive, this offensive, toxic, unworkable pit of evil, which creates things like the residential schools, which creates things like disproportionate outcomes for Indigenous people. It's this centralized pit of evil that just spews out demons. You know what I mean? And and so they think, well, heck, this is part of this institution. I just want to tear this institution down, right? So whatever I can tear at, I just kind of tear at. And then you get a conflict between people who go, well, hold on a second, especially people with historical knowledge. It's not that easy to it's not that easy to reinvent a relatively tolerant, you know what I mean, functioning, prosperous society. There's a lot if you want to apple cart the whole thing, right? There's lots of ways those apples that can land that you're gonna, think to yourself, I like them in the cart before, right? If the more historical knowledge you have, the more you're like, there could be a backslide. Don't kid yourself, right? And that other group thinks, well, when you bring this idea up of there could be a backslide, it's because you're trying to deny enfranchisement. You know what I mean? To um, um, you're running an exclusionary puck, right? You're in the center of the normality. You're in the center of the elite. You're in the center of this ball, right? Of what's regular and normal, right? And then there's these excluded groups on the outside because of some identity, right? And so you want to keep this ball together. And so that's why you keep putting your hand together and saying, well, hold on a second. I don't really think you can invent the legal system, the policing system, the educational system in 10 minutes by yourself. You know what I mean? You got to take what you have and modify it. And they're like, no, this thing is just broken from the core. Yeah, is that a fair assessment of what some people think?
Yeah, no, it's. I'm working on an article on that very situation. You do have involved in this whole Ryerson thing people who have it in for our current society. They think it's all wrong, the values are all wrong, and so on. And yes, they will jump onto this. But at the core, there is still this group of people who feel um, hurt by residential schools. They feel hurt by these poor innocent children that were buried in Kamloops, and they get involved. So you've got the two groups, but the dominant one in this are people who uh, feel hurt by what has happened. Now, when it comes to violence, when it comes to tearing down a statue, some of it will be young people who, I'm young, I'm full of energy, I want to do something. And you've got these other people who jump in, these people who want to get anything that's anti society. You know, the society's wrong, we're going to do it. So it's a combination, but you mustn't lose sight of the fact that at its core are people who feel hurt, they feel anger, and they want to get even.
The problem I think that this is the £1,000,000 problem elephant is that no one on any side has any idea what to do. Like they don't. Like let's be realistic. I read through parts of the truth reconciliation thing. It starts going into this part where it's like we can't even get agreement. It's fair about this. We can't even get agreement amongst First Nations people of what to do.
Yeah.
Right? Like they're shattered internally about what to do or what could mean reconciliation. And then it goes from a group of people who are still to this day obviously trying to modernize, right? I want our reserve. I want our power to do whatever we want with it. If we want to log it, that's our business. If we want to put in private property, that's our business. This is our nation to do with what we want. Sort of libertarians. And then you get to this other thing where they sort of mentioned, well, some people won't accept truth and reconciliation until the until the earth is no longer being damaged by people, right? And I don't. I mean, I just try and be flip or whatever, but I don't know what that means, like in and of a sentence. And then you start trying to parse it away, and it's very clear to me. Every piece of paper comes from a tree that was that was cut down. I mean, permanently, temporarily. So you have my point is we can't parse through that whole thing right now, but you obviously have a constellation of people in every group, and I think we have to start facing that no one has some master plan. No one knows what to do, like exactly what to do to solve all these things. It's all just steps to attempt to make it better. Unless you have the master plan, Ron, tell us now.
Well, one of the things I always point out, it's First Nations, not First Nation. These are groups of people who have differing ideas. There isn't a single Indigenous point of view. There are many. And I wouldn't be surprised if some people in the Indigenous communities are looking at what's going on at Ryerson and saying, that's a bit much. You know, we don't like residential schools, but to do something like that. So to, to you're pulling a lot of different things into this discussion. But the point is, there are different points of view. So not all Indigenous people are saying, yeah, glad you got that. Glad we tore down that statue.
Listen, I think strategically, if you brought me into as a consultant, to talk about what we're doing, I think you've made I think this is a terrible mistake. This staring down the statue, I think you have really caused a problem because we had people working on this. The institutions were not deaf to it. You know what I mean? No one was ignoring it. Everyone had a process that they were grinding through. And at that end of that process, if they had decided to take the statue down, there would have been a event out of it. You know what I mean? What's going to go instead of that? Are we having no statues? Are we going to augment the statue? Are we going to have his best friend? I mean, you could have taken the same statue and said, okay, let's contextualize this. We'll build a statue of Ryerson farming alongside of Native people while he's a Methodist preacher. You know what I mean? Let's redo that statue. And you know what I mean? Or something like that. We could be like, well, that's nice. My point is, you could have had a whole bunch of people go in and had a plan and had everybody on the plan had this control. Now you've set up two issues. Okay. You're going to have backlash from people who go, that's just not the way you do things.
No.
That's not the way you do things. You do not want a society in which random bands of people take it upon themselves that they're smarter than everybody else that does it. Kids, I always give a pass. They're just idiot kids. You know what I mean? We could give the kids a pass.
Well, don't tell them that.
Well, of course not. That's why it's fun to be young.
Exactly.
I got, again, if you've made it through this whole thing and you're in Ryerson, you look back at yourself 10 years and then and past, and you go, what an idiot. And then 10 years go past, you go, what an idiot. You know what I mean? Like, if you're not looking at yourself 10 years ago and thinking, what an idiot, well, you have no growth. You didn't grow at all as a person in 10 years. That's everyone. I'm not suggesting that you're in some different band than me. I'm the exact same idiot. I just am a slightly older idiot and hopefully a little wiser, but who even knows about that?
You talked about destruction and things like that. Going back to my analogy, that snowball, you drop at the top of the mountain and it rolls down and gathers snow. And when it hits the bottom, it destroys everything there. That's what's happened here.
But as a Ryerson alumni, I'm going to get one thing off my chest. You don't have to react to this, Ron, because you work with these people. I don't. Okay, and then I don't like this statement that came out of Ryerson University that said, the statue will just not be rebuilt. I would have preferred personally that said, we have people working on this. We're not deaf to it. You know what I mean? We're going to wait for the report and we're going to consider what it says in that report. I think that would have been very intelligent, even if you want to go under truth and reconciliation, because you can push the snowball back up the hill. You can say, oh no, we're going to recontextualize this thing. We're going to explain the history to people. You know what I mean? If Ryerson University powers up the top and says, hold on, there's residential schools type 1 and residential schools type 2, you're confused on the history. You know what I mean? Our guy's legitimate. Our guy is a hero, is what you're effectively saying. Right? You're confused that he died and his torch was not passed on.
Yeah, I've been receiving emails from people saying, why didn't the president say something other than what you just said? Well, we're not going to bring the statue back. We're not going to put up another one. That's done. I'm sure he's trying to manage the situation and keep both sides happy. It's impossible to do, but he's trying that. So, yes, you're absolutely right. People are saying to me, yes, he should have been clearer. We have a process. It's working its way through. It will come up with a conclusion.
Well, listen, the only free consulting is I would give him is that Ron's pointing out the major people are legitimately hurt. right? And this seems to pacify the legitimately hurt, but it stirs up people type 4. It's that last class of person we're talking about that wants to tear the whole system down. Just goes, oh, we were able to tear down statues. Can we tear down classrooms? Can we tear down? What else can we tear down? Because they conceive of the whole contraption of modern education as evil. Because if your society is evil, what's the point of learning math? So you can go out and do more evil now with mathematics, right? Like what? How are you going to contribute with knowledge if the whole thing is rotten from the core up, right? So they consider the whole thing, and not only evil, it's sort of in their mind. This whole topic for another podcast, but irredeemably evil, right? And that's their frame of reference. So that's the problem. If you're going to pacify group 1, but group 4 is going to go, aha, what can we do now? Because their whole concept is to create a snowball so big that it whacks out, I don't know, the structure of society. But it's very difficult to do, even in places that completely crumble. Nobody can figure out what else to do.
I know. Yeah, they agree on what to tear it down. They don't agree on what to replace it by.
Yeah, that's what I want. And I was trying to figure out who to get to sort of have a different perspective. And I'm like, I want someone who can tell me what that other paradigm is. You don't like this paradigm? Okay. What's that other paradigm? And they're kind of like, well, you and asking to explain the paradigm shows that you're part of the problem. And I go, yeah, maybe. I mean, it's a clever charge, right? That I'm so in love with the thing that I don't want it disintegrate, and therefore subconsciously everything I say, is my conscious mind is constantly hostage to this subconscious that's so in love with the status quo it won't let me like think my way out of the box. Possibly, I can't say that's not true. I don't think it's true, obviously, but I wouldn't under their analysis. My problem is my kids can't eat nothing. So we still have to have a system where they eat. We still have a system where their rights are respected. I have daughters. They have to go forward in a society where they're completely respected, and can get jobs and no violence is done to them. And so I don't like apple carting society in favor of who knows what.
But you're putting words in people's mouths. And what's going to happen when people say things like that? The people who feel very strongly say, and would you like your children to be among the 215 children at Kamloops?
Absolutely not.
That's how they come back at it. You're making excuses.
Yeah, but I am not making any excuses for the terrible. Uh, uh, this is how the whole thing started off, right? There's no construction that excuses 6,000 kids dying away from their parents. There's no construction in the world that excuses that, and there's no construction in the world that excuses um, uh, uh, the wholesale. Actually, you know what? There's no construction that excuses the negative process. Which, as much as you'd like to add English, you don't have to remove their native language to add English. You see what I'm saying? The additive process, you can constantly say, well, they're trying to teach them English, they're trying to teach them agriculture. These are all good things. And you can say, I believe that good people of good nature think that that's true. And then you get to the negative process. Why can't they speak their native language at recess? Like, why exactly? Why is there this negative degradation of their existing, cultural practices? It's the negative. Is that fair, or am I just out to lunch?
No, it's fair. All I was pointing out is that when you try and offer your reasons for why certain things are wrong, there's a comeback. There's always a comeback. So you talk about how I have to earn money to look after my children, and so we have to have the society we have. And the comeback is you don't care about those children. So what I'm saying, it's not logical, but it is part of this whole discussion, and we have to be aware of that.
I think that's true.
One of the things that's used against people like me, I've seen this in a couple of places now. Well, white historians wrote uh, nice things about Egerton Ryerson to the task force that Ryerson set up. And, the implication is white historians can't see things the right way. So there's always this element of uh, nastiness, that is, trying to use things against people in an argument. So Another thing I've had was, well, you're entitled to your opinion, and I have my opinion. Yours is an opinion. Mine is based on historical records. But this this is why it's such a difficult argument, and it's part of this whole current vogue of people to feel so strongly about the need for social reforms that they overlook certain aspects.
I think they, yeah, no, no, listen, I agree with everything you said there. And I, is when we get to the post Egerton schools, you're like, oh no, hold on a second. There's definitely, this did not come from a good place of love and support. Right. And that I think is what's going to be most problematic of people who listen to this through is that why would you just not, if the theory is, you know, it's the core of evil, and you're unable to see these things because you don't want to destabilize, your own place in history or your own position or whatever it might be. Okay, but then you just have this universally sunny vision of everything, right? And there is no defender. Like, I don't know anyone who's like, you know what, I wish the government would set up a compulsory school that I have no control of, thousands of, now, because transit's better, right, and thousands of miles from where I think I mean, I get queasy, when the government just put this is off topic, we'll wrap up soon, but the government just put this thing in divorce. They changed the divorce laws. And so, under the divorce laws, you used to have a right to see your kid. Like, it was about, because it was about parental rights. Well, they changed it around so that it's not about rights. You don't have rights. It's now in the benefit of the child, right? It always makes me queasy when the government starts coming up with constructions of what's good for the child. You know what I mean? Over the rights of the parents. Obviously, there's cases which are so terrible. You can make a corner case, but I never like that. So, what's next, Ron?
My hope is, because of course I'm on one side of this whole thing, my hope is that people will read information and there will be a groundswell that will say, no, you're not going to change the university. And let's give Egerton Ryerson his due. You know, what has been put before the public has not been correct. And having looked at information or heard information, we want to take a stand on the other side. This is not going to please people who are totally caught up in this, who are angry, who are hurt, who want their solution. But I think it's time that other people said, let's have a reflective conversation and let's come up with the right solution. I think that I'm hoping that's what is next. As they say, that snowball is coming at me and it's awfully big right now. So,
Well, I don't think you've done yourself any disservice here, because if you want a teaching moment, right? Just differentiating the two residential school systems and the swap, and I think that, like, if you want a teaching moment, what a better teaching moment is that? It's got two things with it. It's got the era of history doesn't exist. If you think racism just goes away and can't be remarshaled for sinister purpose later, I will direct you to the history, you know what I mean, of the Canadian residential school system. And people historically got caught up in things, but again, you have to, if you're trying to have a reconciliation. It seems to me that's a much better teaching moment is keeping the name. How could you keep this incredibly racist thing? You know what I mean? Okay, here's why. Because you're wrong about what was going on in the 1800s, but you're not wrong about what was going on in the 1900s.
yeah.
And we can keep our champions from the 1800s and still, you know what I mean?
Even somebody who's guilty is a teachable moment. When the villain of the day was John A. Macdonald, I would go on radio, television, defending keeping his statues. Because if you get rid of the statues, you get rid of the whole issue. You never have to discuss it again. If you keep the statue and use it as a teaching tool, look at all these statues of Johnny McDonald around the country. Why are they there? What else is there about him, aside from the fact he was the father of the country and so on? What else is there about him that we should know? that he was the father of the residential schools.
The thing is, I'm almost listen. I'm going to be even more on this side of it. I like the monument, evil or not, that it was here, right? Like if you there'd be nothing more I don't know what could be crazier than walking in Germany is a bit of an extreme case, but if you see a statue of Hitler, it makes the whole thing real again. You're like, people put this up, they built this, they were into this at this time. There's nothing more horrifying than that to me. I don't know that I don't like a statue as a as a judge of. I don't see a statue and go, well, that must be a great guy. He got a statue.
Right.
We don't. There's statues all over the place in Rome. We don't know the history of any of them. You know what I mean? But it marks a time when people built this thing, and then you can say, what did they think when they? I'm with you. I would be very remiss to keep statues, even of characters that were negative, because of what you said. Right? People know so little history as is.
Exactly.
You take away those. If you want to ablate Canadian history, if you're sitting here thinking we're going to get this guy and this guy and this guy, and we're going to make sure that the entire Canadian history washes out, you know what I mean? It's some sort of nebulous evil. Good news, you've made it easier for people.
Yeah.
Because they're not going to grow up being part of nebulous evil. There's going to be like, well, my grandparents come from the Ukraine. What did it have to, what does it have to do with me? What happened in 1900s Canada, right? And they'll just wash their hands of it. So it's, I think, more powerful to keep the thing there. And then somebody asks, well, what did happen here, 200 years ago, and on and on. So I'm with you, Ron.
I could tell you bad things about Wilfrid Laurier, William Lyon Mackenzie King, Tommy Douglas, voted the greatest Canadian, Pierre Trudeau. They all did things that were negative.
Well, we're going to keep that for another podcast, Ron.
I know, but the point is, this is all teachable. I use it in my courses. Use it to get at the real fabric of history. That's the point.
Exactly. It's history. It's not a storybook, right? It's not contrived by an author to come to some point. Well, thanks very much, Ron. I appreciate this very much. I hope people listen to it. And thank you for being very gracious with your time.
Well, thank you for having me on. I enjoyed chatting with you. And I hope that this finds an audience that will reflect on things.
I'm sure it will.